The morning fog clung to the airfield at Boxted, England, as Captain James Mitchell stood beneath the massive wing of his P-47 Thunderbolt. Engineers had initially called the aircraft impossible, too heavy, too complex, a mechanical nightmare that would never achieve what its designers promised. Yet here it stood, 7 tons of American engineering that had already proven its doubters wrong dozens of times over. What those engineers couldn't have predicted was that in just 4 days during the brutal winter of 1944, this exact machine would become legend, destroying 14 Nazi supply convoys and changing the course of operations in occupied France. Mitchell ran his hand along the cold metal, feeling the rivets beneath his gloved fingers, knowing that the impossible was about to become routine. If you're enjoying this story of courage and determination, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories from history. The briefing room at Boxted was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. 23 pilots sat in worn wooden chairs, their leather jackets creaking as they shifted weight, waiting for Major Thompson to begin. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the smell of aviation fuel and damp earth. Mitchell sat in the third row, his notebook open, pencil ready. He'd flown 42 missions since arriving in England 6 months ago, but something about Thompson's expression told him this one would be different. Thompson cleared his throat and pulled down a map of northern France. Red circles marked locations along the main supply routes leading from the German border toward the coast. Intelligence had confirmed massive convoy movements, desperate attempts by the Wehrmacht to reinforce positions before the Allies could consolidate their gains from the Normandy invasion. The trucks carried ammunition, fuel, replacement parts, everything the German forces needed to maintain their defensive positions. "We've got a 4-day window," Thompson said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Weather's supposed to hold, mostly clear skies, good visibility. Intelligence says they're moving supplies at night now, trying to avoid our daytime patrols, but they still have to use the main roads, and that's where we hit them. Each of you will fly multiple sorties per day. Maintenance crews are working around the clock to keep these birds in the air." Mitchell wrote down the coordinates, noting the terrain features Thompson highlighted. The roads wound through small French villages, past farmland that had been fought over for months, through forests that provided cover but also limited visibility. It would be low-altitude work, dangerous flying, where anti-aircraft fire could tear a plane apart before the pilot even knew he was being targeted. After the briefing, Mitchell walked across the muddy airfield toward his assigned P-47. The ground crew was already preparing her for the first mission, checking oil levels, inspecting ammunition feeds, ensuring every system functioned perfectly. Sergeant Bill Crawford looked up from beneath the engine cowling, grease smeared across his weathered face. "She's ready for you, Captain," Crawford said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Replace those spark plugs you mentioned, tightened up the aileron controls. 8 50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready, full fuel tanks. She'll fly like a dream." Mitchell climbed onto the wing and peered into the cockpit. The instrument panel gleamed in the weak morning light, dozens of gauges and switches that he knew by heart now. The smell of oil and hydraulic fluid was comforting, familiar. He'd spent hundreds of hours in this exact seat, learning every quirk and characteristic of the massive fighter bomber. The P-47 wasn't graceful like the Spitfire or nimble like the Mustang, but it was tough, unbelievably tough, capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Crawford leaned against the fuselage, his expression serious. "You be careful out there, sir. Intelligence reports say Jerry's bringing up more anti-aircraft guns, expecting us to hit those convoys. They know we're coming." "That's why we're going in low and fast," Mitchell replied, running through his pre-flight mental checklist. "Hit them before they can track us properly. Use terrain masking where possible. The Thunderbolt can take a beating, but I'd rather not test that theory more than necessary." The first mission launched at 0600 hours. 4 P-47s in tight formation climbing through the overcast layer into clear sky above. Mitchell led the flight, with Lieutenant Danny Roberts on his wing and two more pilots, Captains Mike Henderson and Tom Bradley, flying as the second element. The Pratt & Whitney engines roared with reassuring power, 18 cylinders producing over 2,000 horsepower each, driving the massive propellers that pulled them skyward. They crossed the English Channel at 12,000 feet, the water below grey and choppy, whitecaps visible even from altitude. Mitchell checked his instruments constantly, monitoring engine temperature, fuel consumption, oil pressure. Everything read normal, the Thunderbolt performing exactly as designed. Around him, the other three aircraft maintained perfect formation, wingtips almost touching, 4 deadly machines heading toward occupied France. The French coastline appeared through scattered clouds, the beaches still scarred from the invasion 6 months earlier. Mitchell descended to 8,000 feet, then 6, dropping down to where the Thunderbolts could use their speed and firepower most effectively. Below, the countryside spread out in patches of brown and green, small villages connected by narrow roads, farmland divided into irregular fields. Roberts's voice crackled over the radio. "Lead, this is 2. Got visual on the primary road, bearing 095 degrees, distance approximately 8 miles. Mitchell banked right, bringing the formation around to approach the road from the northeast. The plan was simple. Find the convoy, hit it hard with machine gun fire, then egress quickly before German anti-aircraft batteries could respond effectively. Intelligence estimated each convoy consisted of 20 to 30 trucks, invaluable targets that could significantly impact German defensive capabilities. The road appeared as a thin grey line cutting through the landscape. Mitchell squinted against the glare, scanning for movement, for any sign of vehicles. Then he saw them. A long column of trucks moving west, canvas-covered cargo beds probably loaded with ammunition or fuel. 32 vehicles, he counted quickly, spaced about 50 yards apart, traveling at moderate speed. "All flights, this is lead," Mitchell transmitted. "Target confirmed, 30-plus vehicles, heading 270 degrees on primary road. We'll make one pass, west to east, engage with all guns, break right after the pass, and regroup at Rally Point Alpha. Execute on my mark." He pushed the stick forward, diving toward the convoy from 7,000 feet. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The Thunderbolt shuddered slightly as it accelerated, the wind screaming past the canopy. Below, the trucks continued moving, unaware of the death approaching from above. At 2,000 feet, Mitchell armed his guns and centered the lead truck in his gun sight. The 850 caliber machine guns in his wings held over 3,000 rounds total, enough firepower to shred light vehicles in seconds. He waited until the range closed to 1,000 yards, then pressed the firing button. The Thunderbolt shuddered as all 8 guns opened fire simultaneously, the noise deafening even through his helmet. Tracer rounds arced downward in brilliant streams of light, converging on the convoy. The lead truck exploded as the heavy bullets tore into its engine and cargo, flames erupting skyward. Mitchell adjusted his aim, walking the fire down the column, seeing trucks swerve and crash as drivers panicked. Behind him, Roberts, Henderson, and Bradley added their firepower to the assault. The entire convoy disintegrated in less than 15 seconds. Vehicles burning, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions, soldiers running for cover in the ditches alongside the road. Mitchell pulled up hard at 500 feet, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat as the Thunderbolt clawed for altitude. Break right, he called, banking away from the target area. Anti-aircraft fire began erupting around them, black puffs of flak appearing in the sky, German gunners finally responding to the attack. A shell burst close to Henderson's aircraft, shrapnel pinging off the armored belly, but the Thunderbolt flew on undamaged. They regrouped at 8,000 feet, 5 miles east of the convoy, and Mitchell assessed the results. All 4 aircraft accounted for, no significant damage, and below them the German convoy burned, thick black smoke rising into the winter sky. One mission down, 13 more convoys to find. They returned to Boxted 90 minutes after takeoff, landing in sequence on the rain-slicked runway. Crawford and his crew swarmed Mitchell's aircraft immediately, checking for damage, refueling, reloading ammunition. The turnaround time was 45 minutes, barely enough for Mitchell to grab coffee and review the next target area with Thompson. The second mission launched at 1000 hours, this time with 6 aircraft, 2 additional P-47s, joining the formation. Intelligence had identified another convoy moving through the Ardennes region, larger than the first, possibly carrying fuel for German armor. Mitchell felt the fatigue already setting in, the constant stress of combat flying, the adrenaline surges, followed by crashes. But there was no time to rest, not when the enemy was vulnerable. This convoy fought back harder. As Mitchell led his flight down through scattered clouds, German anti-aircraft positions opened fire while the Thunderbolts were still 2 miles out. The sky filled with black bursts that rocked the heavy fighters, forcing constant evasive maneuvers. Mitchell jinked left and right, varying his altitude, making himself a difficult target while trying to line up his gun run. The convoy consisted of fuel trucks. Dozens of them, stretched along a narrow valley road. Mitchell knew hitting fuel trucks was incredibly dangerous. The explosions would be massive, potentially catching attacking aircraft in the blast. But that was exactly why they had to be destroyed. Fuel was the lifeblood of the German military machine. He dove through the flak, ignoring the shells bursting around him, focused entirely on the lead fuel truck. At 800 yards, he opened fire, the .50 caliber rounds tearing into the thin-skinned vehicle. The truck exploded with shocking violence, a massive fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air. Mitchell flew through the edge of the explosion, feeling the heat even through the cockpit canopy, the Thunderbolt buffeted by the blast wave. Behind him, the other 5 pilots pressed home their attacks, ignoring the danger, concentrating on destroying as many trucks as possible. The valley became an inferno, fuel trucks exploding one after another, the heat so intense that Mitchell could feel it at 1,500 feet as he pulled up and away. Robert's voice came over the radio, strained but triumphant. "Lead, this is 2. Estimate 25 to 30 trucks destroyed. That convoy isn't going anywhere." They landed back at Boxted just before noon, and Mitchell climbed out of his cockpit to find Crawford staring at the underside of his aircraft. 3 large holes punctured the belly armor, evidence of how close the flak had come to catastrophic damage. Crawford shook his head slowly, running his hand over the jagged metal. "You were lucky, Captain," Crawford said quietly. "Few more inches, and that shrapnel would have gone right through the cockpit floor. These birds are tough, but they're not invincible." Mitchell nodded, feeling the weight of the statement. 2 missions down, 2 convoys destroyed, and the day wasn't even half over. Thompson had briefed a 3rd mission for 1,400 hours. Another convoy reported moving through the Bocage country south of Caen. The pace was relentless, demanding, pushing both pilots and aircraft to their limits. The afternoon missions blurred together in Mitchell's memory later. A convoy near Falaise, trucks loaded with ammunition that exploded spectacularly when his guns found them. Another near Argentan, supply vehicles caught in the open on a straight road with nowhere to hide. Each attack followed the same pattern. Dive from altitude, pour fire into the targets, pull up through increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire, regroup and return to base. By the time darkness fell on that first day, Mitchell had flown 6 missions, destroyed portions of 5 different convoys, and logged over 8 hours of flight time. His hands trembled slightly from fatigue as he filled out the mission reports, detailing targets engaged, ammunition expended, damage observed. Around him, other pilots did the same, their faces showing the same exhaustion, the same determination to continue. Crawford and his crew worked through the night, repairing battle damage, replacing worn parts, ensuring every aircraft would be ready for the next day's missions. Mitchell watched them for a while before heading to his quarters, marveling at their dedication, their skill, their absolute refusal to let the pilots down. The second day began before dawn, with Mitchell back in the briefing room listening to Thompson outline new targets. German convoy movements had increased overnight, intelligence suggesting they knew the Americans were systematically destroying their supply lines and were making desperate attempts to push through whatever they could. More targets meant more opportunities, but also more danger as the Germans reinforced their anti-aircraft defenses. Mitchell flew 7 missions that second day, each one more challenging than the last. The Germans had started dispersing their convoys, breaking them into smaller groups that were harder to find and attack efficiently. They moved during twilight hours, used forest cover where possible, employed smoke screens to obscure targets. Mitchell and his fellow pilots adapted, flying lower, searching more carefully, coordinating attacks to maximize effectiveness. During the 4th mission of that second day, Mitchell's Thunderbolt took serious damage. A flak shell burst directly beneath his left wing, shrapnel tearing through the metal skin, severing hydraulic lines, damaging the aileron control. The aircraft rolled violently to the left, and Mitchell fought the controls, using brute strength to level the wings, compensate for the damage. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel, indicating multiple system failures. Roberts formed up on Mitchell's wing, assessing the damage visually. "Lead, you've got serious damage to that left wing. I can see hydraulic fluid streaming out and your aileron looks like it's barely attached. You need to head home now." Mitchell gritted his teeth, fighting to keep the Thunderbolt flying straight and level. The controls felt mushy, unresponsive, the aircraft wanting to roll left constantly. He trimmed as best he could, using rudder to compensate, coaxing the damaged fighter toward the coast. Every mile felt like a victory, the English Channel appearing finally like a salvation. The landing at Boxted was the most difficult of Mitchell's career. With damaged hydraulics, he had limited braking capability, and the injured aileron made controlling the aircraft during the crucial final approach nearly impossible. He came in fast, afraid to slow down too much and lose control, touched down hard on the main gear, and used every bit of runway before finally stopping just short of the grass overrun. Crawford met him as he climbed shakily from the cockpit, surveying the damage with professional concern. "We can fix this," the sergeant said after a long moment. "But it's going to take most of the night. You'll need a different bird for the afternoon missions." Mitchell flew his remaining missions that day in a different P-47, one that felt slightly unfamiliar despite being essentially identical to his regular aircraft. The muscle memory was there, the procedures the same, but something felt off, like wearing someone else's shoes. Still, he pressed on, leading more attacks, destroying more convoys, contributing to the systematic dismantling of German supply capabilities. By the end of the second day, Mitchell and his squadron had accounted for 9 convoys destroyed, hundreds of vehicles burning across northern France, supply lines severely disrupted. Intelligence reports confirmed that German units were already experiencing ammunition shortages, that fuel rationing had been implemented, that the attacks were having their intended effect. The third day brought worse weather, low clouds and intermittent rain that made flying even more dangerous. Visibility dropped to barely a mile in some areas, forcing Mitchell to navigate by instruments and dead reckoning, trusting his training and experience to find targets in the murk. The Germans took advantage of the weather to move more convoys, gambling that the poor conditions would limit American air attacks. They gambled wrong. Mitchell led his flights into the weather, using cloud cover to approach targets undetected, breaking through at low altitude to hit convoys before anti-aircraft gunners could respond. The tactics were risky, flying at 200 feet in poor visibility with limited visual references, but they worked. 3 more convoys fell to his guns that day, the Thunderbolts proving they could fight effectively in almost any conditions. During the second mission of the third day, Mitchell's flight encountered something new, a heavily defended convoy with multiple anti-aircraft vehicles integrated directly into the column. As they dove to attack, the sky erupted with defensive fire. Not just the usual flak, but also rapid-fire cannons that could track the fast-moving fighters. Bradley's aircraft took hits immediately, smoke pouring from the engine, the Thunderbolt losing altitude rapidly. "Two's hit," Bradley transmitted, his voice tight with stress. "Engine's failing, I'm losing power. Gonna try to make it back across the channel." Mitchell watched helplessly as Bradley's Thunderbolt struggled to maintain altitude, trailing smoke, the engine coughing and sputtering. The other pilot nursed the damaged aircraft westward, heading for the coast, fighting for every foot of altitude. Mitchell wanted to escort him, provide cover, but the mission demanded he continue the attack. He made the hardest decision of his career and completed the gun run, destroying the convoy while his fellow pilot fought to survive alone. Bradley made it back to England, crash-landing in a field near the coast, walking away with minor injuries, but losing his aircraft. The Thunderbolt had absorbed incredible damage, flying nearly 60 miles with a failing engine, testimony to the rugged design that engineers had once called impossible. Crawford's crew salvaged what they could from the wreckage, cannibalizing parts to keep other aircraft flying. The fourth day dawned clear and cold, perfect flying weather that promised maximum visibility and range. Mitchell felt the accumulated fatigue in every muscle, the mental strain of constant combat, the emotional weight of 4 days of unrelenting operations. But this was the final day, the last push, and intelligence had identified 2 more major convoys that needed to be destroyed before the operation concluded. Mitchell flew his original P-47 again, Crawford having worked miracles to repair the damage from the second day. The aircraft felt right again, responding to his touch, the controls smooth and positive. He ran through his pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, noting with satisfaction that every system showed green, ready for combat. The first mission of the final day targeted a convoy moving through the Vosges region, mountainous terrain that complicated the attack but also limited the convoy's escape routes. Mitchell led 8 P-47s into the mountains, weaving through valleys, using terrain to mask their approach. The convoy never knew what hit them. 34 trucks destroyed in a single devastating pass, the Thunderbolts pulling up and away before German defenders could organize effective resistance. The final mission, the 14th convoy, proved to be the most heavily defended of the entire operation. Intelligence had located a critical supply convoy carrying specialized equipment and ammunition for German artillery units. The convoy was enormous, over 50 vehicles, and it was protected by dedicated anti-aircraft battalions with orders to ensure it reached its destination. Mitchell gathered his pilots for the final briefing, looking at their tired faces, seeing the same determination that had carried them through 4 days of combat. They'd come too far, accomplished too much to let this last target escape. He outlined the plan, a coordinated attack from multiple directions that would overwhelm the defenses, give them the best chance of destroying the convoy while minimizing losses. 12 P-47s launched for the final mission, the largest formation Mitchell had led during the entire operation. They climbed to 15,000 feet, high enough to give them energy for the diving attack, spread out to hit the convoy from 3 different angles simultaneously. The Pratt & Whitney engines roared with full power, the Thunderbolts flying in perfect formation, a display of American air power that would have been unimaginable when engineers first called the design impossible. The convoy appeared below, a long snake of vehicles moving along a valley road, anti-aircraft guns positioned at regular intervals along the column. Mitchell could see the German gunners tracking their approach, training their weapons skyward, preparing to fill the air with steel. He took a deep breath, centered himself, focused on the task ahead. "All flights, this is lead," he transmitted. "Attack pattern Delta, hit them from all sides, simultaneously. Make your passes count, this is the big one. Execute in 3, 2, 1, mark." 12 Thunderbolts dove from the sky like avenging angels, howling down through the clear winter air at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The Germans opened fire, the sky filling with flak, tracers, every weapon they had firing desperately at the attacking aircraft. Mitchell ignored it all, concentrated on his target, the lead vehicle in the convoy, centered it in his gun sight and opened fire. The battle lasted less than 2 minutes, but felt like an eternity. Mitchell's guns tore into vehicle after vehicle, his fellow pilots adding their firepower to the maelstrom. Trucks exploded, ammunition detonated, the entire convoy disintegrating under the overwhelming assault. Anti-aircraft fire claimed one Thunderbolt, Lieutenant James Peterson's aircraft, taking a direct hit that sent it spinning into the ground, but the attack continued relentlessly. Mitchell pulled up through the smoke and chaos, his aircraft shuddering from flak damage. Multiple warning lights illuminating, but the Thunderbolt kept flying, kept responding to his commands. Below, the 14th convoy burned, completely destroyed, nothing salvageable, the mission accomplished. They landed back at Boxted in the late afternoon, the winter sun already setting, casting long shadows across the airfield. 11 P-47s touched down safely, their pilots exhausted but victorious. Crawford and his crew counted over 100 separate flak holes across the 11 aircraft, testament to the intensity of that final battle, but every plane could be repaired, put back into service. Mitchell climbed slowly from his cockpit, his legs stiff, his hands cramped from gripping the controls for so many hours. Crawford approached, offering a canteen of water, his weathered face showing respect and something close to awe. 14 convoys in 4 days, Captain, the sergeant said quietly. The engineers said this bird was impossible, but you proved them wrong. You all did. Major Thompson met the pilots in the briefing room, where maps now showed 14 red X marks across northern France, each one representing a destroyed convoy, hundreds of vehicles eliminated, supply lines severed. Intelligence estimates suggested the operation had delayed German defensive preparations by at least 2 weeks, possibly longer, directly contributing to Allied advance planning. Thompson stood before his pilots, these men who had pushed themselves and their aircraft beyond normal limits, who had accomplished what many thought impossible. He didn't give a speech, didn't offer grand pronouncements. He simply said thank you, and every man in that room understood the weight behind those 2 words. Mitchell returned to his quarters that night, too tired to even remove his flight gear immediately. He sat on his bunk, staring at his hands, thinking about the past 4 days, about the missions flown, the risks taken, the victories achieved. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once called impossible by engineers who couldn't imagine what it would accomplish, had proven itself beyond any doubt. And the pilots who flew them, ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things, had risen to the challenge without hesitation. In the months that followed, the story of those 4 days spread through the Allied air forces, becoming legend, inspiring other pilots, demonstrating what could be achieved with determination, skill, and the right equipment. Mitchell continued flying missions until the war's end, surviving to return home. But he never forgot those 4 days in December 1944 when he and his fellow pilots proved that the impossible was merely difficult, and the difficult could be overcome with courage and conviction. The Thunderbolts that engineers once doubted became one of the most successful fighter bombers of the war, destroying thousands of ground targets, supporting Allied advances, proving their worth in combat again and again. And somewhere in the cold winter sky above France, the memory of 14 convoys burning served as testament to what could be accomplished when skilled pilots, dedicated ground crews and remarkable machines came together in pursuit of victory. Crawford kept working on Thunderbolts for the remainder of the war, maintaining these aircraft he'd come to respect deeply, ensuring they were ready whenever called upon. He never forgot those 4 days either, the constant pressure, the impossible demands, the satisfaction of seeing every aircraft return despite the damage they sustained. The bond between pilot and ground crew, forged in those crucible moments, lasted long after the guns fell silent. The evening of that 4th day brought a rare moment of quiet reflection. Mitchell sat in the officers' mess, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching steam rise from the mugs of pilots around him. These men, barely out of their 20s most of them, had aged years in 4 days. Roberts sat across from him, methodically cleaning his service revolver, the rhythmic motions almost meditative. Henderson was writing a letter home, struggling to find words that wouldn't worry his family, but would somehow convey the magnitude of what they'd experienced. The mess hall smelled of boiled vegetables and mystery meat, the usual fare that somehow tasted better after surviving another day of combat. Someone had managed to acquire a bottle of whiskey, and small portions were being passed around in tin cups, a toast to Peterson, who wouldn't be joining them again. Mitchell raised his cup when it came to him, feeling the burn of the cheap alcohol, thinking about the young lieutenant who'd gone down over France. Peterson had been 23 years old, fresh-faced and eager, always the first to volunteer for the difficult missions. He'd joined the squadron just 2 months earlier, fresh from training, full of confidence that sometimes bordered on recklessness. Mitchell had tried to mentor him, teach him the hard-won lessons of survival in combat, but there was only so much you could learn without experiencing it yourself. The flak that killed Peterson had been a direct hit, instantaneous, no time for pain or fear, just sudden cessation. Mitchell told himself that was some comfort, but it felt hollow. Crawford appeared in the doorway, still in his grease-stained coveralls, despite the late hour. He spotted Mitchell and made his way through the crowded room, carrying a clipboard filled with maintenance reports. The sergeant dropped into a chair, accepting a cup of coffee from Roberts, and spread the papers across the table. "Thought you'd want to see the damage assessment, Captain," Crawford said, pointing to columns of numbers and technical descriptions. 11 aircraft, total of 147 flak holes, 3 damaged engines requiring replacement, hydraulic systems shot to pieces on 5 birds, 2 cracked propeller blades, and more bent metal than I've seen in my entire career. And somehow we kept them flying. Mitchell studied the reports, marveling at the punishment the Thunderbolts had absorbed. 1 aircraft had taken 17 hits from anti-aircraft fire, including 3 that penetrated the cockpit area, missing the pilot by inches. Another had lost half its rudder to a near miss, but still flew 60 miles back to base. The ruggedness of these machines, combined with the skill of crews like Crawford's, made the seemingly impossible routine. "How long until they're all mission-ready again?" Mitchell asked, already knowing the answer would be measured in days, not weeks. Crawford grinned tiredly, showing teeth stained with coffee and tobacco. 72 hours, Captain. 3 days, and we'll have every one of these birds back in fighting shape. My boys don't sleep much anyway." The third pilot at the table, Henderson, looked up from his letter. 3 days sounds like luxury compared to what we just went through. 4 days, 52 missions flown by our squadron, 14 convoys destroyed. The intelligence officers are saying we delayed German reinforcement operations by at least 2 weeks, maybe more. That's 2 weeks our ground forces don't have to face fresh ammunition and fuel reaching enemy positions. Roberts holstered his revolver and leaned forward, his young face serious. "I heard Thompson talking to command earlier. They're calling this operation a complete success, beyond original expectations. The brass is already planning similar campaigns, hitting supply lines systematically, strangling the German ability to sustain defensive operations. We proved it could be done." Mitchell nodded slowly, feeling pride mixed with exhaustion. The strategic implications were significant, but right now, all he could think about was sleep, real rest that lasted more than 3 or 4 hours before the next mission briefing. His body ached from the constant G-forces. His eyes burned from hours of scanning skies and ground for threats and targets. His hands had cramped so severely during the last mission he'd barely been able to release the stick. Crawford collected his papers and stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours bent over engines and airframes. "Get some rest, Captain, all of you. Tomorrow's another day, and this war isn't over yet. But tonight, you earned your sleep. 14 convoys in 4 days, that's one for the history books. After Crawford left, Mitchell remained at the table with Roberts and Henderson, too wired to sleep despite the crushing fatigue. They talked quietly about home, about the lives waiting for them when this was all over, about dreams deferred and futures uncertain. Henderson was engaged to a girl from Ohio, carried her photograph in his jacket pocket, looked at it before every mission. Roberts had a younger brother flying B-17s out of a base in East Anglia, hadn't seen him in months, but knew he was somewhere over there, fighting the same enemy from different altitudes. The conversation drifted to the P-47 itself, this remarkable machine that had exceeded everyone's expectations. Henderson recalled the first time he'd seen one back in training, the sheer size of it intimidating. 7 tons fully loaded, he said, shaking his head at the memory. I thought there was no way something that heavy could dogfight, could survive combat against fighters designed specifically for air-to-air combat. But then I flew her, felt that Pratt & Whitney engine respond, discovered what all that weight meant in terms of protection and firepower. Roberts added his own observations, technical details about dive performance, about how the Thunderbolt could outdive anything the Germans had, could build speed in a descent that made it nearly impossible to intercept. And those 850s, he continued, his eyes distant. When all 8 guns fire together, it's like thunder, like the name says. I've seen single bursts cut trucks in half, tear through armor plating, destroy targets that should have required bombs. Mitchell listened, appreciating these moments of camaraderie, this brotherhood forged in combat and sustained by shared experience. These men trusted him to lead them into danger, trusted his judgment, followed his orders even when it meant flying into walls of anti-aircraft fire. That trust was humbling, something he never took lightly, a responsibility that weighed more heavily than any aircraft. The mess hall gradually emptied as pilots drifted away to their quarters, seeking what rest they could find before the next day's operations. Mitchell finally stood, feeling every one of his 26 years plus about a decade more, and made his way through the cold December night to his own bunk. The stars were brilliant overhead, thousands of them visible in the clear air, and he paused to look up, thinking about all the men on both sides of this conflict who were looking at those same stars, wondering when it would end. His quarters were Spartan, just a bed, a footlocker, a small desk with a lamp. Photographs pinned to the wall showed his family back in Michigan, his father and mother, his younger sister. He hadn't written them in over a week, had barely had time to think about anything beyond the next mission, the next target, the next threat. Mitchell sat at the desk and pulled out paper and pen, trying to compose a letter that would reassure them without lying about the dangers he faced daily. The words came slowly at first, then faster as he found his rhythm. He told them about England, about the countryside so different from Michigan, about the people he'd met, the crews he worked with. He mentioned the successful missions without detailing the violence, described the Thunderbolt without explaining how close he'd come to dying in it. He told them he was safe, which was a lie, but a necessary one, the kind of lie that let families sleep at night while their sons fought wars oceans away. When he finished the letter, Mitchell sealed it in an envelope, addressed it carefully, and placed it in the outgoing mail basket. Then he finally lay down on his bunk, still in his uniform, too tired to undress, and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, the sleep of absolute exhaustion, and for a few precious hours the war ceased to exist. The dawn came too soon, grey light filtering through the window, bringing with it the sounds of aircraft engines being tested, crews preparing for another day of operations. Mitchell woke slowly, his body protesting every movement, muscles stiff and joints aching. He forced himself up, splashed cold water on his face from the basin in the corner, and stared at his reflection in the small mirror. The face looking back seemed older than he remembered, lines around the eyes deeper, expression harder. Breakfast was hurried, toast and eggs and more coffee, eaten while standing because sitting seemed too final, too much like settling in when there was work to be done. Thompson appeared as Mitchell was finishing, carrying more maps, More intelligence reports, more targets that needed attention. The Major looked as tired as Mitchell felt, the strain of command showing in his posture, his voice. "Good morning, Captain," Thompson said, the greeting automatic, professional. "Hope you got some rest. Weather forecast is good for the next few days, and intelligence has identified several more high-value targets. Command wants to maintain pressure on German supply lines, keep them off balance, prevent them from recovering from the losses we inflicted." Mitchell nodded, accepting the inevitability of continued operations. The 4-day intensive campaign was over, but the war continued, would continue, until someone finally surrendered or was too exhausted to fight anymore. He took the papers Thompson offered, scanning target coordinates, convoy routes, defensive positions. More of the same, different locations but identical missions: find the enemy and destroy them. Crawford found him near the aircraft, conducting his pre-flight inspection, running hands over control surfaces, checking for anything that might have been missed during the night's maintenance. The sergeant carried a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, poured them both without asking, and stood quietly beside the Thunderbolt's massive landing gear. "She's ready for you, Captain," Crawford said simply. "New engine, fresh hydraulics, every system checked and double-checked. This bird will fly today like she did 4 days ago, before all the damage, before all the missions. That's a promise." Mitchell accepted the coffee gratefully, sipping the hot liquid, feeling warmth spread through his chest. "I don't doubt it, Sergeant. You and your crew work miracles. These aircraft should be grounded for weeks after the punishment they took. But here they are, ready to go back into combat. That's something special." Crawford shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "We just do our jobs, same as you. You put your life on the line every time you climb into that cockpit. Least we can do is make sure the machine doesn't let you down. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "we've gotten attached to you pilots. Losing planes is bad enough. Losing the men who fly them would be worse." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the sun rise higher, burning off the morning mist, revealing another day that would demand everything from everyone. Other pilots were emerging from their quarters now, making their way to the flight line, preparing for the briefing that would send them back into the skies over France. Roberts appeared, looking more rested than Mitchell felt, his step lighter despite everything they'd been through. "Morning, Captain, morning, Sergeant. Beautiful day for flying, assuming we ignore the part where people try to shoot us down." Henderson and Bradley joined them, the latter still moving stiffly from his crash landing 3 days earlier. Bradley's aircraft was beyond repair, had been stripped for parts and written off, but the pilot himself had refused medical grounding, insisting he was fit to fly. Thompson had assigned him to another Thunderbolt, a replacement bird fresh from the depot, and Bradley had spent hours yesterday familiarizing himself with it, making it his own. The briefing at 0800 hours detailed 3 separate missions for the day, smaller operations than the massive 4-day campaign, but still critical to maintaining pressure on German logistics. Mitchell would lead the first flight, targeting a convoy reported moving through the Champagne region. Roberts would lead the second mission in the afternoon, and Henderson had the evening sortie, if weather permitted. As Thompson outlined the plan, Mitchell studied the map, mentally rehearsing the approach, considering angles of attack, identifying potential threats. The convoy was smaller than those they'd hit during the intensive campaign, only about 15 vehicles, but intelligence suggested it carried specialized radio equipment and command staff. High-value target, worth the risk. The mission launched at 0930, 4 P-47s climbing through scattered clouds into brilliant sunshine above. Mitchell led with confidence born of experience, his aircraft responding perfectly to every input. Crawford's promise of readiness proved accurate. They crossed the channel at 10,000 feet, descended as they approached the French coast, began the hunt for their target. Roberts spotted the convoy first, calling out coordinates over the radio. Mitchell banked to investigate, saw the vehicles moving along a secondary road, trying to use tree cover for concealment. Not 15 trucks as intelligence had reported, but 22, and they were moving fast, racing to reach their destination before American fighters could intercept them. Mitchell set up the attack quickly, diving from 8,000 feet with throttle full forward, building speed until the Thunderbolt screamed through the air at over 400 miles per hour. The Germans saw them coming, anti-aircraft guns opening fire, but Mitchell was already committed, already focused on the lead vehicle, finger tightening on the trigger. The guns roared, tracers reaching down to touch the convoy, and the lead truck exploded under the concentrated fire. Mitchell pulled up sharply, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, and watched his wingmen press home their attacks. In less than a minute, the convoy was destroyed, vehicles burning, soldiers scattering into the countryside. The mission accomplished with textbook efficiency. They returned to Boxted, refueled, rearmed, and launched again in the afternoon for a second mission. Then a third in the evening, the winter sun already setting, long shadows stretching across the landscape below. 3 missions in one day, not as intense as the 4-day campaign, but still demanding, still dangerous, still requiring absolute focus and skill. And so it continued day after day, mission after mission, the war grinding on with relentless momentum. Mitchell flew, Crawford maintained the aircraft, Thompson planned the operations, and together they contributed to the systematic destruction of German capability to wage war. The Thunderbolts proved themselves again and again, absorbing damage, delivering punishment, bringing pilots home safely more often than not. Weeks became months, winter gave way to spring, and the tide of war shifted inexorably toward Allied victory. Mitchell accumulated hundreds of combat hours, dozens of destroyed targets, experiences both terrible and transformative. He lost friends, made new ones, grew harder in some ways and more compassionate in others, shaped by circumstances beyond his control into someone different from the young captain who'd first arrived in England. Through it all, the P-47 Thunderbolt remained constant, the impossible machine that engineers had once doubted, now proven beyond any question to be one of the most effective weapons of the war. Every mission added to its legend, every successful return from combat validated the design. Every pilot who walked away from a shot-up aircraft thanked whatever genius had made them so resilient. Crawford continued working his miracles, keeping the fighters airworthy, despite shortages of parts, despite the accumulating wear and tear, despite the constant demands of combat operations. His crew became legendary themselves, known throughout the base for their skill and dedication, respected by pilots who understood their lives depended on quality maintenance. Years later, long after the war ended, Mitchell would visit air museums, seeing restored P-47 Thunderbolts on display, reading plaques that described their service, their victories, their significance. He'd run his hand along the metal skin, feel the rivets beneath his fingers, remember the sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing, the vibration through the airframe, the absolute confidence that this aircraft would bring him home no matter what. He'd remember Crawford and his crew working through freezing nights to repair battle damage, never complaining, always delivering on their promises. He'd remember Roberts and Henderson and all the others who flew beside him, who trusted him to lead them, who placed their lives in his hands mission after mission. He'd remember Peterson and the others who didn't make it home, whose sacrifice bought time and distance for Allied forces to advance. Engineers had called the Thunderbolt impossible, but they'd been wrong. The aircraft was exactly what it needed to be, a weapon of war that could absorb punishment, deliver devastating firepower, and be operated by skilled pilots to achieve remarkable results. Those 4 days in December proved it conclusively. 14 convoys destroyed, hundreds of enemy vehicles eliminated, and most importantly, pilots brought home safely to fight another day. The impossible had become routine, performed by ordinary men rising to extraordinary challenges, supported by dedicated ground crews and brilliant engineering. History was written in the smoke trails over occupied France, in the mission reports filed after each successful sortie, in the survival of pilots who should have died but didn't because their aircraft refused to quit. Mitchell carried those memories for the rest of his life, honored them by living well, by appreciating peace when it finally came, by never forgetting the price paid by so many to achieve victory. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once called impossible, had helped win a war and brought him through it alive. That was legacy enough for any machine, any mission, any moment in history.